His brothers took the land, the cattle, and the house, but forgot the cellar their father sealed. What he would find there wasn't just about reclaiming an inheritance. It was about uncovering a truth that would either shatter him or set him free. If you're finding this story today, maybe it's because you also know what it's like to be on the outside looking in. If these kinds of stories about second chances and hidden truths matter to you, consider subscribing. It means a lot to know you're here. The day I turned 18 was the day I became officially homeless. There was no cake, no party, just a thin, gray blanket on a metal frame cot and the smell of industrial cleaner that never quite faded. Mr. Henderson, the supervisor at the state group home, handed me a cardboard box containing the sum total of my life. 3 worn-out shirts, a pair of jeans, a toothbrush, and a faded photograph of a man I barely remembered. "Well, Leo," he said, his voice flat, trying for kindness but landing on weary. "You're a man now. The world's yours." He didn't say the next part, but I heard it anyway. "And we're not responsible for you anymore." For 2 years, since I was 16, this place had been my world. 2 years of scheduled meals, mandatory group therapy sessions where everyone lied, and the constant, low-grade hum of other people's misery. It wasn't a home, but it was a roof. It was a predictable kind of purgatory. Now, the gates were open. The world wasn't mine. It was a terrifying, formless void I was being shoved into. I had $74 in my pocket, earned from mopping floors and washing dishes in the facility's kitchen. It felt like a fortune, and nothing at all. My plan, if you could call it that, was to find a bus station, pick the cheapest ticket to anywhere, and just disappear. Start over. Become someone else. Someone who didn't have the word orphan clinging to him like a second skin. As I signed the release papers, the phone on Henderson's desk rang. He answered it with a sigh, listened for a moment, and then his eyebrows shot up. He looked at me, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "It's for you," he said, holding out the receiver as if it were a venomous snake. A lawyer. I took the phone, my hands suddenly slick with sweat. Lawyers meant trouble. In my life, they'd only ever appeared to deliver bad news. "Hello?" My voice was a squeak. "Am I speaking with Leo Vance?" The voice on the other end was calm, deep, and professional. It was a voice that cost money. "Yes." "Mr. Vance, my name is Arthur Davison. I was your father's attorney. I'm calling to inform you that as of today, your 18th birthday, the final provisions of your father's will are to be executed. I need you to come to my office." My father. The words hung in the air, heavy and strange. My father, Daniel Vance, had died in a tractor accident when I was 15. A tragic, messy end on the farm that had been his whole life. After his death, my older brothers Mark and Thomas had taken over. They were 10 and 12 years older than me, already men with their own lives, their own hardness. They'd never had much time for the quiet, skinny kid who preferred books to baling hay. After the funeral, they told me there was no room for me anymore, that I'd be better off in the system. They said Dad had left a mountain of debt, that the farm was barely solvent. Sending me to a state home was, they claimed, the only responsible option. A clean break. I hadn't heard from them since. "His will?" I asked, my throat tight. I thought there was nothing." "That is a matter for discussion in person," Mr. Davison said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "My office is in Oak Haven. I trust you know where that is." Oak Haven. The town just a few miles from the farm. The place I had sworn I would never go back to. "I don't have a way to get there," I mumbled, the shame of it burning my cheeks. A moment of silence. "I will wire the funds for a bus ticket to the station nearest you," he said, all business. "Be at my office tomorrow at 10 a.m. Don't be late." He hung up. I stood there, the dead phone still pressed to my ear, the hum of the dial tone a hollow echo of the confusion roaring in my head. A will, a lawyer. a summons back to the place where all my wounds were born. The $74 in my pocket suddenly felt even smaller. The vague plan to disappear evaporated, replaced by a single, terrifying destination. I had to go back. I had to know. Mr. Davison's office was on the second floor of a brick building that smelled of old paper and floor wax. It was the kind of place that felt permanent, unshakable. He was a man in his late 60s, with a neatly trimmed gray beard and eyes that seemed to see more than you wanted them to. He didn't smile, but he didn't frown either. He just observed. He gestured for me to sit in a worn leather chair that sighed as I sank into it. "Thank you for coming, Leo," he began, folding his hands on the large mahogany desk between us. "I'll be direct. Your father's passing was complicated. The estate was, as your brothers likely told you, heavily leveraged." He slid a thick document across the desk. The last will and testament of Daniel Vance. My breath hitched. Your brothers, Mark and Thomas, as the elder sons and existing partners in the farm's operation, were named primary beneficiaries. They inherited the land, the equipment, the livestock, and the farmhouse. He paused, letting the words land. It was exactly what I'd expected, what my brothers had told me. The confirmation still felt like a punch to the gut. All of it. The fields we'd walked, the barn I'd played in, the house where my mother had hummed lullabies before she got sick. It was all theirs. And me? I whispered, my voice barely audible. Mr. Davison looked down at the document. "To my youngest son, Leo Vance," he read, his voice neutral, "I bequeath the sum of $1 to be paid upon his 18th birthday." $1. My vision swam. It wasn't just disinheritance, it was a statement, an insult, a final, posthumous shove out the door. All the grief and abandonment of the past 3 years coalesced into a hot, bitter knot in my stomach. He hadn't just left me, he'd renounced me. "There is one other item," Davison continued, ignoring the tears welling in my eyes. He reached into a desk drawer and pulled out a small, heavy object. He placed it on the desk. It was an old, ornate iron key. It was black, heavy, and intricate. I recognized it instantly. "He left this to you as well," the lawyer said. "It is, according to the addendum, the key to the root cellar." The cellar. My mind flashed back to the summer before my father died. He'd spent a week working on the old cellar. Not fixing it up, but sealing it. He'd replaced the old wooden door with a heavy, steel-plated one and fitted it with a complex industrial lock. He'd told me he was closing it off for good, that it was structurally unsound. I remember asking him why he was using such a strong lock if it was just going to be sealed. He'd looked at me with a strange, sad expression and said, "Some things need to stay closed, Leo, to keep them safe." My brothers had laughed about it, calling it another one of the old man's eccentric projects. They'd forgotten about it as soon as the door was shut. But I hadn't. Mr. Davison pushed a single, crisp dollar bill and the heavy key across the desk. "That concludes the execution of the will. The dollar is a legal formality to ensure the will cannot be contested on the grounds of you being forgotten. The key is yours to do with as you please. Your brothers were not informed of its existence." He stood up, signaling the meeting was over. "Leo," he said, his professional mask slipping for just a fraction of a second. His eyes held a flicker of something that might have been pity, or maybe a warning. "Your father was a complicated man. He did what he believed was necessary." I walked out of that office in a daze, the iron key heavy in my pocket, the single dollar bill clutched in my hand. My brothers had everything: the land, the house, the legacy. And me? I had $1 and a key to a forgotten, sealed hole in the ground. I should have crumpled the dollar, thrown the key in the river, and bought that bus ticket to nowhere. But I couldn't. That look in my father's eyes when he sealed the door, the lawyer's strange, final words. A tiny, stubborn seed of a question had been planted. Why? Why go to all that trouble? Why give me, the disinherited son, the only key? I stood on the sidewalk in Oak Haven, the town I'd fled, and made a choice. I wasn't leaving, not yet. I was going to the farm. I was going to open that door. The bus ride from the city had been a slow, lurching transition from concrete to green. Now, walking the 3 miles from the Oak Haven bus stop to the farm, I felt like I was moving backward in time. The air grew thick with the smell of damp earth and distant manure, a scent so familiar it made my chest ache. Every landmark was a ghost. The crooked oak tree where I'd built a terrible treehouse, the rusted-out gate of the Miller farm whose cows used to get loose, the sharp bend in the road where I'd scraped my knee clean to the bone falling off my bike. This was my home, or it had been. I didn't know what I was walking toward. A confrontation? An empty house? I had no right to be there. The property belonged to Mark and Thomas. If they found me, they'd call the sheriff for trespassing. The thought sent a jolt of fear through me, but it was overshadowed by the pull of the key in my pocket. It felt like a magnet, drawing me forward. As I rounded the final bend, the farmhouse came into view, and my heart sank. The place looked hollowed out. The paint, once a cheerful white, was peeling in long, curling strips, revealing the gray, weathered wood beneath. The front porch sagged. The fields, which my father had kept meticulously, were overgrown in patches, the rows of last season's corn stubble looking like broken teeth. A brand-new, garish pickup truck, Mark's, I presumed, was parked near the barn, but the old, reliable farm truck my dad had loved was gone. They were stripping it, selling it off piece by piece. The realization hit me with a fresh wave of anger. They didn't love this place. They were just consuming it. I waited, hiding behind a thicket of overgrown blackberry bushes, until I saw Mark's truck rumble down the long gravel driveway and turn onto the main road, heading away from the farm. He was gone for the day. Thomas lived in town with his family. He only came out when there was heavy work to be done. The coast was clear. My heart hammered against my ribs as I slipped out from my hiding place and walked onto the property. Every crunch of gravel under my worn-out sneakers sounded like a gunshot. The air was still and heavy. The house was locked, of course. I peered through the grimy kitchen window. It was worse than I'd imagined. The sturdy oak table my father had built was gone. The curtains were gone. It was just an empty, dusty box. They'd taken everything of value. Grief and rage warred inside me. This wasn't just a house. It was the container for my entire childhood. And they had gutted it without a second thought. Shaking, I turned my attention to my real purpose, the cellar. The entrance wasn't inside the house. It was an old-style root cellar with slanted storm doors set into the earth about 20 feet from the back of the house, built into a small, grassy mound. When I got there, I found them covered in a pile of junk. Rusted barrels, a broken lawnmower, a tangle of old tires. It wasn't just neglect. It was deliberate. They'd used it as a dumping ground. It took me the better part of an hour of hard, sweaty work. I heaved the barrels aside, their metal edges digging into my palms. I wrestled with the tires, the rotten rubber smell filling my nostrils. Finally, I cleared the last of the debris. There they were, the heavy, steel-plated doors my father had installed, and in the center, a single, formidable-looking lock, tarnished by the weather, but still solid. My hands trembled as I pulled the iron key from my pocket. It felt ancient, like something from a fairy tale. I slid it into the lock. For a horrifying second, it resisted. I thought, this is it. It was all for nothing. The key is wrong. But then, with a little more pressure, it slid all the way in. It fit. I turned it. The sound was not a simple click. It was a deep, resonant clunk of heavy tumblers falling into place. A sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth. It was the sound of something long sealed finally giving way. I took a deep breath, grabbed the thick iron handle, and pulled. The door was incredibly heavy. It groaned in protest, metal scraping against metal. With all my strength, I lifted it open. A wave of cold, musty air washed over me, smelling of damp soil, stone, and something else. Something clean, like old paper. It was the smell of time itself. Darkness gaped before me, a set of steep concrete steps leading down into blackness. I stood at the threshold, my body buzzing with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. I had no light. I hadn't thought that far ahead. I fumbled in my pocket, my fingers closing around the small flip phone I owned. Its screen would have to be enough. I switched it on, its pale blue light a pathetic weapon against the profound dark. Holding it out like a shield, I took the first step down into the cellar. The air grew colder with each step. The weak light of my phone screen barely pierced the gloom, revealing damp stone walls and a hard-packed dirt floor. It was larger than I remembered, a single, cavernous room. And it wasn't empty. Stacked neatly against the far wall were a dozen large, sealed plastic tubs, the kind you use for long-term storage. Each one was labeled in my father's familiar, blocky handwriting. Most of the labels were simple: winter blankets, old tools, photo albums. My brothers hadn't just forgotten the cellar, they had assumed it was full of worthless junk, just like the stuff they'd piled on top of it. But one tub, sitting on its own in the center of the room, had a different label. It just said my name, Leo. My heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of my chest. I knelt before the tub, my phone's light trembling in my hand. The lid was secured with heavy-duty zip ties. My pockets held nothing but the key and the dollar bill. I looked around frantically, and my eyes landed on a rusty pry bar leaning against the wall, left over from my father's construction. It took a few tries, my hands clumsy with adrenaline, but I finally managed to snap the plastic ties. I lifted the lid. The first thing I saw was a thick, sealed manila envelope, also with my name on it. Beneath it was something that made me gasp: stacks of cash. Neatly bundled stacks of $100 bills. It wasn't a fortune, but it was more money than I had ever seen in my life. Maybe $10,000, $15,000. Enough to start over, enough to disappear for real. My mind reeled. Why? Why would he leave me this, but publicly disinherit me? It made no sense. My hands shaking, I picked up the envelope. I tore it open. Inside was a letter, several pages long, written on yellow legal paper in my father's hand. I sat down on the cold floor of the cellar, the pale light of my phone illuminating the page, and I began to read. "My dearest Leo," the letter began. The words blurred, and I had to blink hard to clear my eyes. He hadn't called me that in years. If you are reading this, it means you are 18 and you are alone. And it means I am gone. I am so sorry for that. I am sorry for everything. I know you must hate me. I know you must feel like I threw you away. I need you to understand that I didn't. I was trying to save you. The phone slipped from my grasp, clattering to the floor and plunging me into darkness. I fumbled for it, my fingers numb. I had to keep reading. I had to know. I found the phone and aimed its light back at the page. "The farm is drowning in debt, son. Not my debt, your brother's. For years, Mark and Thomas have been taking out loans against the property, telling me it was for equipment or seed, but it was for other things. Bad investments. Gambling. They were bleeding this place dry, and I was too blind, too proud to see it until it was too late. When I finally confronted them, they laughed at me. They told me the bank owned the farm now, not me. And they were right. There's a lien against this property so large it would take a miracle to pay it off. If I had left you any part of the land or the house, I wouldn't have been leaving you an inheritance. I would have been leaving you a crushing, impossible debt. The moment you turned 18, the creditors would have come for you. They would have taken everything and left you with nothing but a ruined name. I had to stop reading. I couldn't breathe. The story I had told myself for 3 years, the story of a father who didn't want me, who had cast me aside, was a lie. The disinheritance, the single dollar, it wasn't an insult. It was a shield. It was a legal firewall to protect me from the mess his other sons had made. He hadn't abandoned me. He had protected me. By leaving you nothing in the will, I made you legally separate from the estate and its debts, the letter continued. Your brothers get the land, but they also get the bill that comes with it. It's a poisoned gift. They think they've won. Let them. Their greed will be their undoing. This money I've left you, it's everything I had left. I saved it for years, a little at a time, in cash, where they couldn't find it and the banks couldn't touch it. It's not much, but it's enough for a fresh start. A clean one. Take it, Leo. Go somewhere new. Build a life for yourself, far away from all this. Don't look back. This farm, this family, there's nothing left for you here but pain. I dropped the letter and just sat there in the cold, musty dark, the phone light shining on my face. And I began to cry. I cried for my father, for the secret he'd carried, for the terrible choice he'd had to make. I cried for the lonely, angry boy I had been, hating a man who had only been trying to save me. I cried for the years of misunderstanding, for the gulf of silence that had separated us at the end. The cellar, this place I thought was a tomb, was a sanctuary. It wasn't a place where things were forgotten. It was a place where the truth had been kept safe, waiting for me. I sat there for what felt like hours, the cold seeping into my bones, but I barely felt it. The emotional storm inside me was a raging inferno. Grief was the first wave, raw and overwhelming. The father I had mourned was not the man I had lost. I had lost a protector, a strategist, a man who loved me enough to let me hate him if it meant I would be free. The weight of that sacrifice was crushing. How could I have been so wrong? How could I have spent 3 years building a monument of resentment to a man who deserved a statue of honor? Then came the anger. A white-hot, purified rage directed at Mark and Thomas. They hadn't just been negligent or selfish. They had been parasites. They had drained the lifeblood from my father, from his land. And then they had cast me out and lied about it. They'd let me believe our father was a failure and a deadbeat, all to cover their own tracks. The image of Mark's shiny new truck parked outside the decaying farmhouse flashed in my mind. They were still at it, still consuming, still destroying. My father's letter had been clear. Take the money and go. Don't look back. It was a father's last wish, a plea for his son to escape the wreckage. And for a moment, that seemed like the only sane option. I had the money. I could walk out of this cellar, walk off this farm, and never see Oakhaven or my brothers again. I could get on a bus and be 1,000 miles away by morning. A new name, a new life. The clean break my father had paid for with his reputation and his last dollars. It was a tempting vision, a life without the ghosts of the Vance farm. But as I sat there, the crumpled letter in my hand, another feeling began to surface, pushing through the grief and the rage. It was a quiet, stubborn thought. If I left, they would win. They would finish what they started. They'd suck the farm completely dry, sell the last acres to developers, and move on without a single consequence. They would get away with it all. My father's name would remain tarnished, remembered in town as the man who ran his farm into the ground. The story they had crafted would become history. His sacrifice would be for nothing. My father had saved me from the debt, but he had also left me a choice. His letter was a plea, not a command. The cellar held more than just the box with my name on it. There were other tubs, photo albums, old tools, and one marked Farm Records, 1995 to 2015. The label was mundane, but my father was not a mundane man. He was a man who planned, who hid things in plain sight. He had left me a key, a letter, and a stash of cash. What if he had left me something else? A weapon? My hand, still trembling, reached out and brushed the dust off the farm records tub. My father's last words in the letter echoed in my mind. Their greed will be their undoing. Was that a prophecy, or was it an instruction? Right now, in this moment, I want to pause the story and just talk to you for a second. If you've made it this far, you're not just listening to a story about a farm and a cellar. You're here for the part where it all changes. Maybe you've had a moment like this in your own life. A moment where you found out that a story you'd been telling yourself for years was completely wrong. A moment where you had to choose between the easy path of walking away and the hard path of fighting for the truth. It's a lonely place to be. If this is hitting you, if you know what that crossroads feels like, I just want you to know you're not alone. The people who follow these stories, we get it. So, if you feel comfortable, I'd love for you to share in the comments. Have you ever had to choose between running and fighting? Your story matters. Now, let's get back to the cellar. I knew what I had to do. Driven by this new, fragile sense of purpose, I pried open the tub labeled Farm Records. It was filled with dusty, leather-bound ledgers and stacks of manila folders, all meticulously organized by year. It looked exactly like what it was supposed to be, 2 decades of boring agricultural accounting. I started with the most recent years, my fingers stiff with cold as I flipped through pages of fertilizer costs and crop yield reports. It was meaningless to me. I almost gave up. But then, tucked into the back of the 2014 ledger, I found something that didn't belong. It was a separate, smaller notebook. A simple spiral-bound one. On the cover, in my father's hand, were 2 words. Loan log. I opened it. It wasn't a record of his loans. It was a record of his sons. Every time Mark or Thomas had come to him asking him to co-sign a loan against the farm, he had made a note. The date, the amount, the bank, and the reason they gave him. New tractor. Barn roof repair. Seed for spring planting. But next to each entry, in a different color ink, were other notes. Notes he must have made later. Next to new tractor, he had written, saw Mark driving a new sports car in town. Next to barn roof repair. Roof still leaking. Thomas bought a boat. Next to seed for spring planting. Found receipts for a trip to Vegas in Tom's truck. It was a meticulous, secret audit of their lies. He had known. He had known for years exactly what they were doing. But it was worse than that. Tucked into the back of the notebook was a sheaf of folded papers. They were official bank statements. Not for my father's accounts, but for loan accounts he wasn't supposed to have access to. And there were copies of loan applications with his signature on them. A signature that looked just a little bit off. A little too shaky in some places. A little too perfect in others. Forgeries. They hadn't just lied to him, they had committed fraud. They had been forging his signature to secure loans, piling debt onto his name without his knowledge. But there was one last thing. A single, sealed envelope at the very bottom of the tub, tucked under everything else. It was addressed, not to me, but to Mr. Davison, the lawyer. On the outside, my father had written, Arthur, to be opened by my son Leo only in the event of my unnatural death. My blood ran cold. Unnatural death. The official story was that his tractor had rolled on a steep incline. A tragic but plausible accident on a working farm. But my father had been driving that tractor on that land since before I was born. He knew every dip and rise of that property like the back of his hand. Unnatural death. What did he know? What was he afraid of? I didn't open the letter. It wasn't for me. It was a failsafe, a dead man's switch. My father hadn't just left me a shield and a choice. He had left me an entire arsenal. The notebook proved their long-term deception. The forged documents proved their criminality. And the sealed letter to his lawyer that hinted at something far darker. The choice was no longer just about the farm. It was about justice. The path my father had laid out for me was clear. The money was for my survival. The records were for the fight. I stood up, my legs stiff. The grief and confusion had been burned away, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. I knew what I had to do. I carefully packed the small notebook and the forged loan documents into the empty manila envelope from my own box. I took the sealed letter addressed to Mr. Davison. I left the cash hidden in its tub. This wasn't about money anymore. I climbed the steps out of the cellar, emerging from the darkness into the fading afternoon light. The world looked different. The dilapidated farmhouse wasn't a symbol of loss anymore. It was a battlefield. I walked back to town, my steps sure and steady. I found a payphone, a relic just like the key, and I called the number on Mr. Davison's card. When he answered, I didn't waste time. "Mr. Davison," I said, my voice steady. "It's Leo Vance. I'm in Oakhaven. I opened the cellar. We need to talk." There was a pause on the other end of the line. When he spoke again, the weary professionalism was gone. His voice was sharp, alert. "Where are you, Leo? Don't go back to the farm. Stay where you are. I'm on my way." Mr. Davison met me at a small, empty diner on the edge of town. He slid into the booth opposite me, his face grim. He didn't order anything. He just looked at me, his gaze intense. "Tell me everything," he said. I laid it all out. The key, the cellar, the cash. I told him about the first letter. The one explaining the disinheritance was a shield. His expression didn't change, but I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Relief, maybe. Vindication. Then I pushed the spiral notebook and the forged documents across the table. I told him what they were. As he read through the pages of my father's secret log, his face hardened. He examined the forged signatures, his jaw tightening. "I always suspected," he murmured, more to himself than to me. Daniel was proud. He never would have admitted how bad things had gotten, not even to me. Finally, I placed the sealed envelope on the table between us, the one addressed to him. "He left this too," I said quietly. "The outside says it's to be opened in the event of his unnatural death." Davison stared at the envelope as if it were a live grenade. He picked it up, his movements slow and deliberate. He examined the seal, his own name written in his old friend's familiar script. "His death was ruled an accident," Davison said, his voice low. "The tractor's brake line failed on a steep grade." "He drove that hill 1,000 times," I replied. "He knew that machine better than he knew his own hands." Without another word, Davison carefully broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. His eyes scanned the page. I watched his face, trying to read the emotions that flickered there. Shock, anger, and a deep, profound sadness. He looked up from the letter, and his eyes met mine. The last vestiges of the detached lawyer were gone. I was looking at a man who had just had his worst fears confirmed. "Leo," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Your father, 2 weeks before he died, he received an offer from a commercial developer, a very aggressive one. They wanted to buy the farm, bulldoze it, and put up a distribution warehouse. He refused. They made it clear they don't take no for an answer. In this letter, he says that Mark and Thomas met with those same developers behind his back. He believed they were planning to sell the farm out from under him as soon as they could get control of it. He writes, He writes that he was afraid they might try to expedite the process. He didn't have to say the words. Expedite the process. A failed brake line. An accident. It was no accident. Whether my brothers had cut the line themselves or simply neglected to fix it, knowing the inevitable would happen, the result was the same. They had, in one way or another, killed our father for this land. The diner felt silent, airless. The truth was a monstrous thing, sitting there on the table between us. It was so much worse than I could have ever imagined. Mr. Davison folded the letter and put it in his breast pocket. He looked at me, his expression now one of fierce resolve. "Leo, you have two choices. You take the money your father left you, you disappear, and you live your life. No one would blame you. Or, we use this. All of it. We go after them." He tapped the notebook. "The fraud is provable. It's a felony. The contents of this letter," he patted his pocket, "would trigger a full-blown police investigation into your father's death. We can't prove murder, not without more evidence. But we can prove fraud, and we can use the threat of a murder investigation to give us leverage." "Leverage for what?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "For the farm," he said, his eyes glinting. "They committed fraud to acquire loans against an asset that wasn't fully theirs. They leveraged a property whose owner they may have had a hand in killing. We can take them to civil court and strip them of every board and every acre. We can force them to sign the deed over to you, the rightful heir, in exchange for our silence on the criminal charges. We can take it all back." There it was, the real choice. Not just running or fighting, but a choice between my own safety and my father's legacy. To take the clean start he offered me, or to wade into the filth and reclaim the home he had died for. I thought of his hands, calloused and strong, teaching me how to mend a fence. I thought of the pride in his eyes when I showed him a good report card. I thought of him sealing that cellar door, his face a mask of sorrow. He had tried to build a wall to protect me, but some walls are meant to be broken down. "We fight," I said. The word was quiet, but it filled the entire diner. "We take it all back." A thin, grim smile touched Mr. Davison's lips for the first time. "Good," he said. "Your father would be proud. Now, here's what we're going to do." The confrontation didn't happen with shouting in a dusty barnyard. It happened in the sterile, quiet conference room of Mr. Davison's office. Mark and Thomas sat on one side of the mahogany table, smug and impatient, clearly annoyed at being summoned by a lawyer regarding their lunatic little brother. I sat on the other side with Mr. Davison. They looked at me with a mixture of pity and contempt. The little charity case, back for a handout. "Let's make this quick, Arthur," Mark said, tapping his fingers on the table. "We're busy men. What does he want? A few $100 to get lost again?" Mr. Davison didn't answer. He simply slid the spiral notebook across the table. "I believe this is your father's," he said calmly. Thomas picked it up, a puzzled look on his face. He opened it. I watched as his eyes scanned the page, his face slowly draining of color. He shoved it over to Mark. Mark read it, and his smug expression dissolved into a mask of disbelief, then panic. "Where did you get this?" he stammered. "This is junk, it's nothing." "Is it?" Davison continued, his voice like ice. He then slid copies of the forged loan applications across the table. "Bank fraud carries a sentence of up to 30 years in federal prison, and that's the good news." He let that hang in the air. Mark and Thomas stared at the papers, then at each other. The trap was closing, and they could feel it. "The bad news," Davison said, leaning forward, "is that we have reason to believe Daniel's death was not an accident. We have a letter, written by your father shortly before he died, detailing his fear that you were conspiring with developers to take the farm and that you might expedite the process. A formal request to the district attorney to reopen the investigation into his death would be unfortunate. For you, that was it. The final blow. The word murder wasn't spoken, but it filled the room, sucking out all the air. Thomas looked like he was going to be sick. Mark, his face pale and sweaty, stared at me, his eyes wide with a new kind of understanding. He finally saw me. Not as a charity case, but as the ghost of his father, returned for judgment. "What do you want?" Mark whispered, his voice cracking. Mr. Davison slid one last document across the table. It was a quitclaim deed. "You will sign over the entire property, free and clear, to your brother Leo," the lawyer stated. "You will walk away with nothing but the debts you fraudulently acquired in your father's name. In exchange, this notebook, these documents, and the letter to me will remain in my firm's vault. The DA will not be contacted. You will have your lives. You will not have the farm." They stared at the paper. They looked at each other. Their entire world, built on a foundation of lies and greed, had crumbled in the space of 10 minutes. They had no choice. They had lost. Mark picked up the pen, his hand shaking so badly he could barely sign his name. Thomas followed, his signature a frantic scrawl. It was done. They stood up, defeated and broken, and walked out of the room without another word. They didn't even look at me. I was left alone in the conference room with Mr. Davison. The farm was mine. The victory felt hollow. There was no joy, only a profound, aching emptiness. I had won back a house I couldn't live in and land I didn't know how to work, all burdened by the terrible truth of how my father died. "What now?" I asked the lawyer, the words feeling heavy in my mouth. He looked at me, his expression softening. "Now," he said, "you go home, Leo. You start to rebuild." The days that followed were a blur of paperwork and quiet, lonely work. The farm was officially mine, but it felt more like a monument to a tragedy than a home. The first thing I did was go back to the cellar and retrieve the cash my father had left me. It wasn't a ticket to a new life anymore. It was a survival fund. It paid for the property taxes, the utility bills to get the lights and water back on, and for groceries. I spent my days cleaning. I scrubbed the floors of the empty house, trying to wash away the ghosts of my brother's neglect. I pulled weeds in the overgrown garden. I swept the dust and cobwebs from the barn. Each small act was an attempt to reclaim the space, to make it mine. It was hard, lonely work. The silence was the loudest thing on the farm. But slowly, something started to shift. One afternoon, while I was trying to fix a broken fence post, an old pickup truck I didn't recognize pulled up the driveway. An older man with a deeply lined face and kind eyes got out. It was Mr. Miller, our neighbor from the next farm over. "Heard you were back," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Figured you could use a hand with that." He didn't ask questions. He didn't mention my brothers or my father. He just picked up a post hole digger and started working alongside me. We worked in silence for an hour, the rhythmic thud of the tools a comforting sound. When we were done, he clapped me on the shoulder. "Your dad was a good man," he said simply. "Good to have a Vance back on this land who gives a damn." And then he left. A few days later, when I went into Oak Haven for supplies, the woman at the hardware store gave me a discount on paint. "Welcome home, kid," she said with a small smile. These were small gestures, tiny cracks of light in the overwhelming darkness. They weren't much, but they were everything. They were the first threads of a community I thought I had lost forever. The farm was still a wreck. The fields were still fallow. The future was still a vast, terrifying unknown. But for the first time since I was a boy, I felt like I was standing on solid ground. My father had left me more than a key and some money. He had left me a second chance. He had given me back my home, not just the land and the buildings, but the truth of my own story. The inheritance wasn't the property. It was the choice to stay, to fight, to rebuild from the ashes. It was the knowledge that I was my father's son, not in blood alone, but in spirit. Resilient, stubborn, and unwilling to let the darkness win. As I stand on the porch now, months later, I look out over the fields. I've managed to clear one of them, and a local farmer is leasing it from me to plant soybeans. It's a start. The house has a fresh coat of white paint. The porch still sags a little, but it's clean. There are flowers in the garden my mother planted long ago, blooming again after years of neglect. It's not a perfect life. The grief for my father is a constant companion. The betrayal of my brothers is a scar that will never fully fade. Some nights, the silence is still too loud. But it's my life. A life I chose. A life I am building with my own 2 hands, on land consecrated by my father's sacrifice. He sealed a cellar to protect a future he would never see. He buried a truth so that one day I could unearth it and be set free. And I was. The story of what happened here isn't just about a farm, a will, and a family torn apart by greed. It's about the cellars we all have, the sealed-off parts of our past, the truths we're afraid to look at, the inheritances we don't understand. Maybe your cellar isn't a physical place. Maybe it's a box of old letters you're afraid to read, a difficult conversation you've been avoiding, a story you've told yourself about your past that you suspect isn't true. My father's gift to me wasn't the farm, it was the key. The courage to open the door and face what was inside. What this journey taught me is that home isn't a place you're given, it's a place you claim. And legacy isn't what you're left, it's what you build. So I want to ask you, what's the key you're holding? What door are you afraid to open? Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, please consider subscribing and becoming a part of this community. And in the comments below, I'd be honored if you shared a piece of your own story. Tell me about a time you chose to fight for the truth, or a time you found an unexpected inheritance. I read every comment, and I believe, with all my heart, that our stories are how we find our way back home.